Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome to my channel. Since I received a lot of positive feedback on my portfolio video, I decided to also make a video on my comparative study. In fact, I'm actually more proud in terms of presentation and all that about my comparative study than my portfolio, so I was like, why not? And I'm sorry about the terrible angle and lighting, but honestly I don't know why I decided to film in the darkest points of day, but it just happened. Please bear with me. Before I get into it, I'd like to remind you guys that the comparative study, the portfolio, and the exhibition are all marked by different people. So I guess double dipping is kind of allowed, which is just using the same elements in your portfolio and your comparative study, which is kind of what I did. And also FYI, the software I used to create my comparative study was just Microsoft Office PowerPoint 2016. My tips for the comparative study, or just all the elements in HL Visual Arts, is just to dig up as many examples as you can. Of course, this video is also gonna be an example of someone else's work, to kind of give you guys an overview or an idea of how your comparative study should be presented or should be organized. And also, I'm sure you can ask your tutors for some official certified examples released by the IB, because as far as I know, they can definitely get access to them from different forums and stuff. So yeah, just ask your tutor. I'm sure they'll be happy to help you. I know for sure in the comparative study, you're supposed to include 3 very important key elements: formal elements, personal and cultural context of the work and the artist you decided to choose, function and purpose of the piece. So those 3 are like the most important elements. I know there are endless ways to format and present your comparative study, but what I personally chose was to just talk about one artist, including all of these elements, and then moving on to the next artist. I know a friend of mine that did it differently, was to just talk about the formal elements of 3 pieces together, and then functions of 3 pieces together, and like comparing them in themselves. Just choose whatever floats your boat and fits with your work, I guess. Starting on the first page of my comparative study, unlike my process portfolio, I decided to have an actual cover page for my comparative study, just to give the examiner an overview of what kind of topic or theme I'm talking about, the clash of cultural elements and aesthetics in different artworks. The next page is a introductory page, which is basically me talking about my experiences as an immigrant, and also how my constant cultural identity conflict sparked my idea to explore this topic. And then later on, I actually introduced each artist or artwork I'm talking about. So first I introduced an artist called Florence E, which is also an immigrant artist. And the next artist, or should I say designer, I looked at was Marine Sarah, which is a quite popular fashion designer. I'm sure you guys have seen her designs worn by like different artists, like K-pop artists, Blackpink, I don't know, yeah. And the last but definitely not least, I chose Van Gogh, and I just introduced him, his background. Basically, I just introduced each artist and also their background and what element of their work or themselves contributed to this comparative study. In the next slide is just the works I actually chose to compare. Yeah, basically just to like explicitly state, oh, these are the works I'm comparing and contrasting. So for my first piece was the piece by the artist Florence E. It's a collection of installations called Selected Hauntings. For this piece, I basically first talked about my first impressions. I talked about the color, the fabric and material of the installation, the space, just because it is an installation and space is like a really important factor. Keep in mind the formal elements are going to vary immensely depending on what kind of work you chose, what kind of art piece you chose. So for this one, I also talked about the narrative text and embroidery, and yeah, as you guys can tell, like the way I presented my text and images were very like creative, so just play around with it, like don't feel shy, because as far as I know that's also marked. So I really had a lot of fun doing this slide because she had individual pieces on her website, so I just cropped the images and then putting them there. Don't forget to cite them. For the next slide, I moved on to talking about the cultural context and the personal context of the artist and the piece of work. So I actually personally contacted Florence and I interviewed her through email, and I stated that in my text just to show how much effort I put into research and to show how dedicated you are towards this assignment. Yeah, and I just talked about she is a Chinese immigrant in Canada, how the values between traditional Chinese society and obviously compared to Canada, some different traditional values clash. And on the same slide, I also talked about the purpose and function of her piece, which was basically commemorate the culture and document her experiences, and basically the internal and external voices that responds to some discrimination or the experiences she had being an ethnic minority, I guess. In the next slide, I move on to my second piece, which is a painting by Van Gogh called Flowering Plum Orchard. This painting was a replica of a Japanese woodblock print, so it's really unique and kind of niche in Van Gogh's works. Like, my first impression of this was that it didn't seem like something done by Van Gogh because the aesthetics were very oriental and Asian. But basically I also included the formal elements of the original piece plus his replica because he's basically just copying the original. So I talked about the composition of the original piece. I also talked about the medium and texture, because in the original piece they use like different kind of dyes, and obviously in Van Gogh's piece he used oil to create the same image, but it gave off really different vibes. In the next slide, it's still formal elements. As you guys can tell, like depending on the piece, you might have more things to talk about in formal elements than function and purpose, for instance. So it really depends on your piece of work. But in this slide, I also talked about the palette of the two pieces. I talked about in Van Gogh's piece, his colors were definitely more saturated than the original, which gave a more energetic and youthful vibe. I also talked about shape and value. The Japanese woodblock print, like the lines were sharper than in Van Gogh's oil painting, blah blah blah. I also talked about the use of text because Van Gogh decided to add a border of text to it. I think he used it for decoration, so I also talked about that. Moving on to the next slide is where I talk about the cultural context of Van Gogh's piece. It was when Japanese aesthetics were all the rage in Europe, and then a lot of people, a lot of artists were inspired by these aesthetics and decided to have take their own spin on just Japanese art. And that's basically the background for this painting. In the next slide, I talk about the function and purpose. I talked about how in traditional Dutch paintings in the older times, they were very dull and gray, and this wave of Japanese art that influenced a lot of artists a lot of Dutch artists, to be exact, was like also a turning point for them, because they started using very colorful palettes instead of very dull, realistic paintings. So it was kind of like a starting point to modern, contemporary, or impressionism kind of art era. Because we all know Starry Night was Van Gogh's like most iconic piece, but we did not know his older paintings or his older works were so dull. And it's really interesting to find out how the Japanese art movement influenced his work immensely in terms of color. Okay, ignoring the fact that my video is gonna look completely different because the sun just set. Moving on from Van Gogh's piece, I started talking about the formal qualities of Marine Serre's fashion designs. And obviously, since it's a piece by a designer, there's much more formal elements and technical side to this piece. I just talked about the color used in the outfit, the fabric used, and the contrast of texture, because there is some like vinyl in there as well as some sporty kind of material. Of course, I also talked about the pattern, because the most iconic logo of Marine Serre was her moon, crescent moon design. And I also talked about how that kind of linked to some Islamic symbols as well. I also talked about the contrast of shape and form in this look, because the dress is like obviously very flowy and the top is also very tight fitting, but the gloves were like very exaggerated and futuristic. In the next slide, I talked about the cultural context of the work and the artist. This collection of hers was inspired by some like mid-century or also like Arabic garment silhouettes combined with like utilitarian looks, which was very interesting to me. Basically, I just talked about also Marine Serre's upbringing, how she played tennis when she was younger, and of course that influenced her to creating sporty outfits. And also I talked about the function and purpose of the entire collection, which is, although she says it's not a political statement, she created this collection after the terrorist attack that happened in Paris. I also talked about Marine Serre as a member of new wave of conscious designers that chose materials from ethical sources. As far as I know, some of her pieces are derived from like secondhand material and scarves and all that, which was definitely really cool. And the designer herself says this collection was about establishing links between different kinds of materials, different kinds of aesthetics, about connecting the older time to the future, which I thought was very cool. And then moving to one of the most important parts is just to compare and contrast the pieces. So in black, I talk about the similarities, and the red is for the differences between the works. In terms of Florence and Van Gogh's piece, their works are both Western portrayal of Eastern aesthetics, because although Florence is Chinese, she is brought up in Canada, so I kind of use that as like my supporting statement. And also the format of both pieces are like vertical, and that's very commonly found in Eastern Asian art. I talked about that as well. And they both used text in their pieces, although they functioned drastically differently, because it was very symbolic. In Florence's piece, text is very, very symbolic, and how in Van Gogh's piece it acted as a sort of border decoration kind of thing. Basically just talk about any physical or literal links there are, and then just state the differences. I also compared Van Gogh and Marine Serre's design. I talked about how they both use vibrant colors to portray like energy and vitality, how both pieces were about establishing links between the East and the West, or like just different cultural elements, because Van Gogh used a Western kind of technique to portray Asian aesthetics, while in Marine Serre's designs she established links by putting different kinds of materials together and different silhouettes. The last but definitely not least, I compared Florence and Marine's pieces. I talked about how they have the same background of being contemporary artists. They both discussed some of the social political issues in their work, and for a visual arts HL you need to talk about also like the links between your own work and the pieces you've discussed. And obviously me and Florence has a very similar upbringing, and therefore our works are very similar in meaning. I just talked about how in her work she talked about her family, and in my works I talk about my family a lot as well. I love how it's just all dark and then there's like this stream of light on me from the light from upstairs in the next building. I love that. Florence and I both created installations. This particular work of mine was inspired by her installation, and then I compared my other self-portrait painting with Van Gogh's painting, how we used similar techniques, very rough and thick strokes of paint. Linking my own work to Marine Serre's work is that we both used motifs. In her designs, the crescent moon is obviously her motif, and then similarly in my work I have my lotus leaf, which is inspired from the name of my hometown in China. It's basically translated to the city of the lotus. So I used that in one of the drawings, and also used that to name one of my audio pieces. So that's basically it. You see, like for the linking to my own works part, it was just very fast and simple. And then the last 2 pages is basically all citations. Please do citations as you go. Don't be like me and do all of your citations in the last step, because that took me like a full ass day, okay? So that's basically it for my comparative study. I really hope this video helped you guys, and similarly like my other portfolio video, if you know anyone that needs help in terms of their comparative study, feel free to share this video to them. Also feel free to comment down below any questions or doubts you have. I'm sure I did not mention everything in my video. I'm more than happy to help you. Yeah, of course, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Give this video a like if you found it helpful, and until next time, love from Stella.